So that's all I've got. I'm going to hand it off to Stephanie, who is a good friend of ours. We've known her for several years and a past life in pharmacy and switched over to um, more nutrition focused work. An extremely knowledgeable and kind person we're fortunate to know. So I will let her say anything else she wants about herself. But happy to know her, happy to have her today, giving us another awesome talk. So take it away, Stephanie.
Yeah, thank you, Cole. What a sweet introduction. I feel very grateful to know you both as well, and to have this opportunity again to share with the ICC. Thanks to the small audience for showing up live. I love that. Um, so yeah, as Cole said, I am a recovering pharmacist. I was in practice for about 6 years in the retail setting. And I don't have a lot of positive things to say about it, except maybe that it was like my behind enemy lines experience. And so I learned a lot in terms of like what I would like to kind of rally against. Um, Turns out I much prefer counseling people on how not to take prescription medications. And I've discovered through my education beyond pharmacy and my own personal healing journey that food is powerful medicine. And I would say more often than not, if we can get the food as medicine in place, then there is no need to bring in pharmaceuticals. And that makes me really happy and pretty passionate. Um, so I have a private practice here in Fort Collins, Happy Gut, Healthy Mind Nutrition, and I work with clients one-on-one virtually. And I primarily sculpt my nutrition recommendations through the lens of the GAPS nutritional protocol, which I think most people probably haven't heard of. It's an acronym. It stands for Gut and Psychology Syndrome. It also, conveniently enough, works as Gut and Physiology Syndrome, and it operates on this basic premise that all chronic conditions can be traced back to the health of the gut. And so I know that a lot of the ICC consists of people who are in mental health. And I just kind of want to plug that gut health is really integral to mental health. It's all connected. So when we heal the gut and we look at nutrition, we end up healing the entire body, and that includes anything that we may have going on in the psychological sense. So it really does carry over. All right, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here so we can jump into this presentation. And yeah, so what I'm hoping to do in this time is to convincingly unmask some nutritional dogma, some of the most dominant narratives that are out there that I find to be particularly harmful and inaccurate. And then hopefully replace that dogma with some more common sense guidance. Um, so without further ado, we're just going to jump into this here. And I always like to start these shares that I do with people by letting everyone know that I am not interested in trying to change anyone's mind. I've lived long enough to know that that's kind of an exercise in futility anyway, and I just don't find it all that interesting. What I do like to do, however, is offer people an alternative narrative for consideration. And that's what I'm going to do in this presentation by offering some factual and pretty generally agreed upon data points. And then I leave it up to my audience to sort of connect those dots in a way that feels most true and resonant for each person individually. Um, and my goal generally is just to encourage curiosity. I think that that's a characteristic that doesn't get enough credit. Being curious, I think it's really it's helpful in navigating this strange sort of post-truth world that we find ourselves in. Um, and this idea of stretching our minds beyond what it is that we think that we know feels like almost like a superpower, because what it is that we think that we know is constantly changing in the light of new evidence and new information, and that information is coming at us pretty fast and furious these days. So, kind of this idea of holding our opinions loosely enough to where they can be modified where needed as new information comes in. So that's kind of what I'm aiming at here. Got a couple of quotes that kind of ground this invitation to openness in a little bit. We've got this first one from Indira Gandhi: "The power to question is the basis of all human progress." And then Einstein was credited with saying, "The important thing is to not stop questioning. Curiosity has its own reason for existing." So, with that being said, we'll roll into the meat, pun intended, of this presentation. And I want to start by discussing these two different terms and drawing a distinction between them, because some folks are maybe not even familiar with the term scientism. And even though these words sound really similar, the outcomes of their application are significantly different. So we're going to start off by looking at science. So, in the most basic of terms, science is a tool of inquiry that is grounded in curiosity and skepticism. And I would say one of the things that I find the most impressive about science when it's properly applied is that it's this incredibly humble sort of practice and endeavor, because it's designed to be constantly evolving through the revision of current models in the light of new evidence. So yeah, very, very humble. Speaking of holding ideas lightly, that's kind of the whole point of the scientific method. And for this reason, hypotheses and theories and even laws are never really proven. They're either supported or refuted by evidence over time. So, in this sense, the science is never truly settled. And I'm sure we all remember not too long ago in Stranger Times, this slogan that was being shouted at us kind of ad nauseum to trust the science. It always made me like raise my eyebrow and giggle to myself a little bit, because that phrase, trust the science, is so antithetical to the nature of science. And so question the science is a much more appropriate slogan. And then there's also this really cool idea in science of the value of outrageous hypotheses. And this is the idea that free and courageous inquiry is really the name of the game with science. Because when we are able to lose sight of the shore and let our imaginations run wild, and when we're like out on the edge of the horizon, like sort of peering into the abyss of the mystery and the unknown, that's really when the biggest discoveries are made. That's where, the paradigm shattering insights end up occurring. And there's this really interesting truism that today's heresy can very often be tomorrow's new paradigm. And we've seen that time and time again throughout history. So all of these things I consider to be the real strengths of science and the scientific method, but it's super important that we recognize that science also has its limits. Principal among them would be the state of our current technology, because we can only understand reality to the extent that our tools allow us to. And so a really classic example of this would be the microscope. Both the light microscope and the electron microscope were pretty paradigm shifting technologies. They allowed us to glimpse this before unknown microscopic world. So we didn't even know that, microorganisms existed until we had the light microscope, and that, cells were the structure of life. So it really did kind of change the way we understand the nature of reality when these technologies came out onto the scene. So another really important limit that I think we should consider when it comes to science and its application is the worldview of the individuals who are actually conducting the science. So the scientists and the researchers themselves, as human beings, they are shaped by the philosophical assumptions of the cultures in which they come from. So here in the West, we're talking about philosophical assumptions like materialism and empiricism and but reductionism and determinism. There's a whole long list of isms. And what these philosophical worldviews do essentially is they create these blind spots, and those blind spots will affect what is deemed worthy of study. And it'll also change the way in which data is interpreted. So, this idea of the practice of a purely objective science is kind of an illusion. because human science is conducted by humans, and the human experience is inherently subjective. So you can't really tease out the subjectivity and get like a purely objective science. All right, so now moving on to scientism. So scientism isn't really a tool at all, or at least not a tool of inquiry. It's more of a dogmatic ideology. So it mimics science. It can cosplay as science, but it's not actually science because it resists the primary um, tenets of science, which are open inquiry and the revision of current models in the light of new evidence. It's actually very resistant to those two practices, those two tenets. It tends to be really rigid and exclusionary. It insists kind of stubbornly and, in my opinion, a little bit obnoxiously, that the materialist application of the scientific method is the only valid method for investigating and understanding reality. And it will deny any other ways of knowing completely offhand. So intuition or contemplative insight or any of the psi phenomena are all completely dismissed offhand. And so it tends to be an impediment to scientific progress because what scientism does essentially is it sets these boundaries of what is considered quote unquote accepted knowledge, and it will dismiss other ideas and evidence that challenge the status quo, not because it lacks or these ideas lack merit or scientific rigor, but these ideas will be dismissed offhand simply because they threaten the dominant worldview. And I would say one of the most insidious aspects of scientism is the way in which it's utilized as a political tool to enforce intellectual conformity and to uphold institutional authority. And it does this primarily by punishing dissent. So if you are a scientist who is doing research outside of those set boundaries of accepted knowledge, you are likely going to get labeled a pseudoscientist. And any work that you've done, in spite of its rigor or validity, is going to be dismissed offhand as pseudoscience. And then additionally, these individuals often end up getting blacklisted. So they can't get published, they can't get funding, and then a lot of times they lose their licenses and they can't get a job. And it's, essentially tantamount to career suicide. So all of this is done essentially to enforce ideological loyalty to the truth that is dictated by the quote unquote scientific authorities. Um, Now, there are examples of scientism everywhere throughout history and, up to present day. I would say there's more scientism happening than there is real science. And a classic example of scientism historically would be the sun-centered or the heliocentric model of the solar system that was proposed by Copernicus and then about 60 years later by Galileo. This idea was vehemently opposed by not only the church, but also the scientific establishment at the time. And that was basically because these new ideas were challenging the cosmology of the time. And so there was a lot of inherent institutional resistance to the revision of this old model of the sun being the center or the earth being the center of the solar system. Um, so I have this quote by Carl Sagan, and let me see if I can, oops, sorry, y'all. I just lost it. Let's see, share. Oh, technical difficulty here. My apologies. Okay, there it is. So I'm going to read the quote to you here. It's science is more than a body of knowledge. It is a way of thinking, a way of skeptically interrogating the universe with a fine understanding of human fallibility. If we are not able to ask skeptical questions, to interrogate those who tell us that something is true, to be skeptical of those in authority, then we are up for grabs for the next charlatan, political or religious, who comes ambling along. So I like that quote because I think it really nicely encapsulates the difference between science and scientism, and also the sort of the responsibility that we have as citizens to understand the difference and push back against scientism when we see it show up. I think learning how to sniff out scientism is a really great tool. And again, as I said, I feel like a lot of the things that are being said these days are more the work of scientism than they are of true science. Okay, and now I'm having a hard time advancing my slides. Oh, shoot, technical difficulties. Sorry, y'all. Hang with me. There we go. Nope, still no. Okay. All right. So the rest of this conversation is going to consist of me trying to answer the question, how do you properly feed a human? So it's a pretty simple question on its surface, but it's been made unnecessarily complex, especially over the past handful of decades. And so I think for the most part, we've lost the ability to answer this question. We've been so thoroughly and so rapidly disconnected from our ancestral wisdom on this topic that I think it's fair to say that most people really just don't know how to answer this question anymore. How do we properly feed ourselves? So, I am going to try to answer this question through the lens of human anatomy, physiology, and evolution. And I really like this perspective and this lens because it helps to ground this sort of amorphous and confusing idea of human nutrition into the biological reality of what our bodies were truly designed to thrive on, as opposed to basing the answer on, dietary trends or, heaven forbid, the current USDA dietary guidelines. More to come on why that's a silly approach. Um, and so I want to start by kind of pushing back on this myth or this idea that humans are omnivores. And in order to do that, I'm going to have to put a finer point on this idea of dietary classifications because generally we think of there being just the three discrete classifications of herbivores, omnivores, and carnivores. But the truth is it's a bit more of a spectrum than these three discrete classifications. So we'll break it down here, starting with herbivores. These are, of course, animals that are designed to survive and thrive exclusively on plant material. And the way in which they're able to survive on a strictly plant-based diet is that they have these highly specialized GI systems. Um, that include these really large microbial fermentation chambers. And within those chambers are, trillions of microorganisms, primarily bacteria. And these bacteria are able to break down and digest the fiber-rich plant material. And it is the metabolites of that fermentation process that actually feed the organisms. So just to give you a concrete example, cows are eating grasses and plants all day, and the microorganisms in their rumen are breaking down that fiber-rich plant material, and the metabolic byproduct of that primarily is short-chain fatty acids. So even though these herbivores are eating a strictly carbohydrate diet, they're actually being nourished by a high-fat diet. So that's the way herbivores are able to eat a strictly plant-based diet, thanks to their microbes. They're the ones who are actually feeding the organism. Okay, so moving on to omnivores, I'm going to put a finer point on it here and talk about true omnivores. So true omnivores are really built for dietary flexibility. And I've included animals like bears, rats, and raccoons. And when we think about these animals, we think about how they are consuming this really opportunistic diet. And they have a far wider range of food tolerance as compared to humans. They can eat spoiled foods, rotting meat. And a variety of plants that would be toxic for humans if we consume them. So they're able to do this to have this really broad sort of digestive capacity because they have a larger microbial fermentation chamber than we humans do. And they also have a broader array of their own digestive enzymes. So this means they can eat a much broader menu, essentially. Now, moving on to the next two classifications, these are sort of terms that are far less commonly known. We have first facultative carnivores, and you can see I've listed humans there along with dogs and foxes. Now, facultative carnivores are really built to thrive on animal foods. We can, of course, eat plants, but this is meant to be more of a temporary fallback. We have this dietary flexibility, but we also have an evolutionary dependence on animal foods for optimal function. Um, Now, this classification of facultative carnivore for humans is still considered controversial in human nutrition science, but that's in spite of the fact that from a biological, anatomical, physiological, and nutrient dependence perspective, this is a much better classification for humans. Now, I do want to add a little caveat here that humans do, some of us, have the potential to thrive on a very carefully planned vegan diet, but only, and I stress only, with supplementation. And so, what that tells us essentially is that a strictly plant-based diet is nutritionally insufficient and therefore inappropriate for humans because unless we're supplementing, we're going to hit these nutrient deficiencies. And I also just briefly want to mention something about supplementation. I'm not against supplements, in general, but it's important for us to realize that when it comes to nature, and that includes, human nutrition, the whole is always greater than the sum of its parts. And so when we get into this kind of reductive model of supplementation, what we're doing is we're pulling out these nutrients and vitamins from their whole food matrix, and then the body doesn't really know what to do with those individual isolated vitamins and minerals in the same way. They're less easily absorbed and utilized by the body. So whenever we get into like reductive models, we've kind of lost the plot. Okay, and then to round this out, we have the obligate carnivores, and these are things like cats, seals, dolphins, and birds of prey. These are animals that require animal foods to survive and thrive. They have a very minimal capacity to digest plant matter, and that's because they have very small microbial fermentation chambers. Okay, so now I want to take a little bit of time to sort of build my case for humans as facultative carnivores by talking about the various ways in which we are optimized to be nourished by animal foods. And we'll start by looking at human anatomy of the digestive system. So from teeth to anus, we really are suited for the consumption of animal foods. So we have the dentition molars, of course, for grinding plant fibers, but we also have the dentition for tearing meat. And then our jaw mechanics are that of vertical shearing, so we chew up and down rather than side to side like herbivores. That allows them to sort of grind the plant material better than we can. We humans have short digestive tracts relative to our body size, and this is an adaptation that allows us to rapidly digest nutrient-dense animal foods. And this would be in contrast to animals that have a more plant-centered diet. They have much longer digestive tracts, which basically allows more time and space for the digestion of less dense and bulkier plant materials. We humans have a highly acidic stomach. We're hanging out at like a pH of 1.5 to 2, and that's really the ideal environment for digesting animal protein. Now, we can, of course, digest plant protein, but it's a much more inefficient process. It takes more time and energy, and that digestion tends to be incomplete. And then we have a small microbial fermentation chamber compared to herbivores and true omnivores. So that would be our large intestine or our cecum and colon. We're only deriving a very minimal amount of nutrition from our microbial fermentation chambers. About 5 to 10% of our nutrient needs are met through this process. So moving on to human physiology, we are largely, almost entirely dependent on our own endogenous digestive enzymes to extract nutrients from our food. About 90 to 95% comes from our own digestive enzymes. The microbial digestion of plant material that does happen in the human digestive system, again, is happening in the large intestine, and that is distal to or beyond the primary site of nutrient absorption, which is in the small intestine. And then I think this is one of the most convincing points is that we humans have a dependence on a number of animal specific nutrients. So these are things that are either absent or present in insufficient amounts or not sufficiently bioavailable in plant materials. So things like vitamin B12, vitamin A in its active form of retinol, D3, heme iron, zinc, DHA, and EPA are both fatty acids that we need. And then creatine, carnitine, and taurine are amino acid-based nutrients that are really only found in sufficient amounts in animal foods. I have a little chart here for people who do well with visual aids. Um, so I'm just going to draw your attention to a couple of things here. If we look at the first two rows, we have the fermentation, microbial fermentation size presented as a percentage of total gut volume, and then also the microbial abundance and diversity. And so we'll just sort of home in on omnivores and then humans as facultative carnivores in those columns. You can see that omnivores have a much larger microbial fermentation chamber. It can be up to half of their total gut volume, whereas in humans, it's only about a quarter. And then omnivores have a much higher abundance and diversity of microbes. And what these data points indicate essentially is that omnivores are much more effective and efficient at deriving nourishment from plant materials than humans are. And then the bottom two rows, we have nutrients, the percentage of nutrients that are derived from microbial fermentation versus endogenous enzyme activity. And you can see here again that omnivores are getting more of their nutrients from fermentation than humans are. And then humans are more reliant on their own digestive enzymes. So we can see that there actually is a difference here between true omnivores and humans as facultative carnivores. Okay, another point I want to make is about the physiological appropriateness of animal foods versus plant foods. So the nutrients from animal foods are much more digestible and bioavailable for humans. And one of the main reasons for that is that plants have these chemicals known as anti-nutrients. And we can think of anti-nutrients as essentially a plant's chemical defense system because plants can't get up and run. They have these anti-nutrients that act as basically a deterrent from them being eaten. And anybody who has had like food sensitivities is probably familiar with some of the anti-nutrients on the list here. We have lectins, oxalates, salicylates, phytic acid, saponins, tannins. It's quite a long list. And what these anti-nutrients do essentially is they cause irritation in the gut lining or in the digestive system of the animals that eat them. And they also can interfere with nutrient absorption. So it ends up debilitating the animal over time. And so this is the way these plants defend themselves. I will just add a little caveat here that there is a way to reduce the effect that anti-nutrients have on the human digestive system, but that involves going back to these ancestral wisdom approaches where you have to properly prepare plants, especially nuts and seeds and legumes and beans, by soaking, sprouting, or fermenting them. And that will deactivate a lot of these anti-nutrients and make them more digestible. But we've lost connection with those food preparation techniques that our ancestors utilized. Um, then there's the point that animal foods simply are better able to more fully meet human nutritional needs. And this, I think, we can kind of conceptualize in a common sense way by just comparing the body structure of animals to humans versus plants to humans. Animals are composed of some very basic or very similar basic building blocks. They have tissues and organs and vasculature and nervous systems. We don't see that in plants. So we're just built from similar stuff. So it would make sense that animal foods are going to give us those similar building blocks that we need to build our own bodies. And we can get a little more sciencey about this idea by looking at the fatty acid and the amino acid profiles. So animal foods have a much more similar fatty acid profile to the human body than plant foods do. Animals and humans have a much greater concentration of saturated fats and monounsaturated fats building our bodies, whereas plants are more polyunsaturated dominant. We do need all three types of fatty acids, but we need the polyunsaturated fatty acids in a much smaller percentage. And then looking at the amino acid profile, animal foods are complete proteins, meaning they contain all 9 of the essential amino acids, whereas most plant foods are incomplete with a handful of exceptions. And then I feel like this, for me at least, is the punchline and like the most convincing argument to be made for humans as facultative carnivores. And that is just to reiterate, if we were to eat a strictly plant-based diet, we would be dealing with nutrient deficiencies. Whereas if we humans eat the way that our ancestors did, which is eating nose to tail, so we would eat the entire animal, not just the muscle meat, but the organs and the connective tissue and the fat and every bit of it. When we eat in that manner, all of our nutritional needs are met. So that to me is really the best case for humans as facultative carnivores. We can also look at the wisdom of how we humans evolved. This is a really great sort of North Star for me when I'm trying to make sense of like any sort of nutrition advice that's out there. I'm like, okay, well, does this align with the way that we evolved to eat? And I find that to be really enlightening and helpful. So just, a very, very, very brief story of how we humans evolved. And our Paleolithic ancestors' meat was really prioritized for about 3 million years. And the reason for that is that the bulk of the time that our ancestors have been evolving, we were either moving into, moving through, or moving out of an ice age. And so as the climate cooled, we had way less accessibility to edible plants. And so that basically gave us this evolutionary nudge towards relying more on nutrient-dense animal foods. And there's also this really interesting theory that animal foods are really what helped to drive human evolution because our ancestors were eating primarily a high fat and high protein diet. And fat and protein are the macronutrients that actually build our body. They're the structural macronutrients. And so if you want to grow a big, fat, juicy brain, you need fat and protein in order to do that. So that's kind of the hypothesis there. Now, our ancestors, of course, did eat some plants, but it was local and it was seasonal. It was never, 365 days a year access to carbohydrates or to plant materials. Um, and there is evidence that some of our ancestors consumed grains minimally, but again, that was also sporadic and regional. And grains were definitely never a dietary staple for our Paleolithic ancestors. But all of that changed with the agricultural revolution that happened about 10,000 years ago. Sounds like a long time, but in evolutionary terms, it was like last week. And that was when we humans suddenly had constant access to grains and carbohydrates that we had never had before. And then we fast forward a bit more into present day and we look at our modern day food supply, and it represents a pretty obvious, stark evolutionary mismatch. It's certainly not shocking to anyone when I make statements like we didn't evolve to eat Pop-Tarts and Impossible Burgers. Our bodies don't know what to do with that. It's not food. And speaking of that, I always kind of relish in ripping on the standard American diet because it's just so awful and abysmal. And I think, the SAD nutritional landscape, it's like the greatest acronym ever. It's so apropos. The standard American diet is pretty sad. It is, of course, completely centered around ultra processed food. Ultra processed food is not food. It is products of food science. They're products of industry. Um, they tax the body rather than nourishing it. So they don't really even deserve the noble name of food. They are, of course, full of refined sugars and carbohydrates, industrial seed oils, which we'll talk more about in a minute, toxic chemical additives, and maybe y'all have heard this little statistic floating around that in the European Union, they allow about 400 food additives into the food supply. And here in the USA, we allow 10,000. And that really has to do with this idea of grass, which is generally regarded as safe. Um, and essentially, what that means is that these food additives are innocent until proven guilty, which is fine for like the model of a justice system, but not so much when we're talking about things that we're putting into the food supply. So, that's part of the reason why we're the sickest nation in the world. And then the standard American diet is really so intertwined with and made possible by the really harmful practices of industrial agriculture, the agrochemical industry, and then this absolutely horrific practice of factory farming. We're in a bit of a pickle in terms of our food systems in this country, and I think that's putting it about as diplomatically as I can. Like we really are in a mess here with the way that we're being fed. And I also just want to name real briefly that our industrial food system was never built upon nutritional principles. It was always built upon profit motives for industry. And so that's, that kind of helps to explain why we're at where we are. Um, so I have a couple of quotes here from Dr. Lauren Cordain. He's actually a professor emeritus at CSU, and an author. And he said more than 70% of our dietary calories come from food that our Paleolithic ancestors rarely, if ever, ate. Um, and then cereal grains as a staple food are a relatively recent addition to the human diet and represent a dramatic departure from those foods to which we are genetically adapted. Discordance between humanity's genetically determined dietary needs and his present-day diet is responsible for many of the degenerative diseases which plague industrial man. Hmm. So, okay, I want to move on to another myth here. And this is one that I am really all about busting because I feel like it is probably one of the most harmful and baselessly persistent myths out there in the nutrition world. And so it's the diet heart hypothesis, and you'll probably recognize this more by the claim, which is that dietary saturated fat and cholesterol increase cardiovascular risk or cardiovascular disease risk, and that polyunsaturated fatty acids from seed oils will reduce that risk. And so this little gem of a hypothesis is brought to us by a man named Ansel Keys. He was an American physiologist that came into prominence in the 1950s. And he conducted what is known as a 7-country study. And this was really sort of the seminal study promoting the diet heart hypothesis. And it really should have been known as the 22-country study because data existed for at least that many countries at the time that this study was conducted. But Ansel Keys decided to exclude the data from 15 countries, so the vast majority, based on what he called poor quality data. Now, I can't really attest to the veracity of that claim, but what I can tell you is that regardless, this is what is known as cherry picking data. And it's a really common pitfall in bad science. And the cherry picking of data in the case of the 7-country study was really magnified by the fact that a number of the countries that were excluded, including France, Germany, and Switzerland, were countries where the people were eating a diet that was very high in saturated fat and cholesterol, and yet they had a very low incidence of cardiovascular disease. So eliminating these data points is really important because this was data that flew in the face of the hypothesis. Um, and when all of the data from these countries is plotted, this correlation that Ansel Keys found pretty much dissolves into nothing. It just becomes a smattering of data points on the graph. Another important thing to consider with the 7-country study is that it was an observational nutritional study. And observational studies can show correlation, they cannot show causation. And that's because observational studies are not controlling for confounding variables. And in this case, it's super relevant because when we're talking about the development of cardiovascular disease, there are a lot of different factors, like what was the rest of the diet like that these people were consuming? Was it high in sugar and refined carbohydrates? Were they smokers? Did they exercise? What was their stress level? What was their socioeconomic status? It's a long list of other factors that need to be considered in the development of this disease state. And those are not controlled for. So what we ended up here with the 7-country study was a weak correlation, and yet it had such massive influence on official public health policy. And the way that we can understand how this came to be is by looking at who Ansel Keys was as a historical figure. He was very well connected. He had friends in high places. He was very politically savvy and charismatic. He was also described as being very domineering and dogmatic, and he did not take well to people offering alternative hypotheses or criticizing his work. And so he basically ended up using his, personality and his clout to push the diet heart hypothesis into the hands of policymakers. And they went forth and made sweeping dietary recommendations for every man, woman, and child in this country based on this weak correlation from this study that wasn't even, very rigorously conducted. And so that to me raises some really important red flags around the questionable ethics of doing something like that. If you're going to make recommendations that the entire country should be following, it probably should be based on, well, certainly not just correlation, but, decent science. But here we are. So, I don't like to hold back when it comes to my opinions on this particular subject. So I'm just going to call a spade a spade. This is really just a big fat lie, and it is still being forced upon us, and it really just kind of makes me angry. But this hypothesis has been debunked and refuted since its inception. There were scientists pushing back against this hypothesis from the very beginning, from jump. But since then, there have been a number of studies that have refuted it. Just to name this, if you want to show causation, then you do a randomized controlled trial. And there have been about 15 randomized controlled trials that have straight up refuted the diet heart hypothesis. They've shown that when you replace saturated fat with polyunsaturated fat, there's no positive change in terms of heart attacks or mortality. And then to go one step beyond that in terms of how concerning this really is, there are about 8 observational studies and 1 randomized controlled trial that actually showed the opposite outcome, that when people have a low level of blood cholesterol, they actually are at an increased risk of all-cause mortality, meaning that lower levels of blood cholesterol are associated with a higher risk of dying of any cause, primarily cancer and infections. But this is showing us that, like, hey, maybe we have it completely wrong, and this is not good advice, that this is actually damaging human health. And then we have the fact that chronic illness has surged since the widespread adoption in this country of the diet heart hypothesis. Now, I know that that claim is a correlation and not showing causation, but I think it's still something important to reflect upon. And then I pulled out this line here because I think that it's so important to keep in mind. And that is that a substantial body of scientific evidence refutes the hypothesis that dietary fat and high cholesterol are primary drivers of atherosclerosis and cardiovascular disease. And even a single rigorously verified study should suffice to reject it. And that clearly is not what has happened. So what we have here is just the poster child of scientism, where a faulty hypothesis, excuse me, that has been debunked still continues to guide official dietary guidelines as well as medical and nutritional advice. So yeah, this is an issue. Um, so there's been a lot of trash talking of saturated fat and cholesterol since the 1950s, and it's still going on for some weird reason. So I feel like saturated fat and cholesterol deserve, a redemption song here. And so that's what I'm going to try and do real briefly is talk about how important these vital biological molecules are, starting with saturated fat. About 30 to 50% of the composition of our cell membranes is saturated fat. So if we want to heal properly and give birth to healthy new baby cells, we need sufficient amounts of saturated fat. They support the immune system. They are essential for brain health. Saturated fat is the primary component of the myelin sheath that insulates our nerve cells and allows us to conduct nerve impulses properly. A number of saturated fats have antimicrobial properties, specifically those found in coconut oil. Saturated fat or foods that are high in saturated fat provide dense and efficient energy for our body, and they also contain high concentrations of fat-soluble vitamins like A, D, E, and K, and we need those. Speaking of things that we need, the story about cholesterol, the fact that cholesterol has been sort of fingered as the villain in the story is just so absurd to me because the truth of the matter is that cholesterol is absolutely essential to life. No animal can live without cholesterol, and that includes the human animal. It is an absolutely essential biological molecule. Similarly to saturated fat, it's a major component of all of our cell membranes. We need cholesterol to make our steroid hormones. So, those are all of our sex hormones, as well as cortisol, our primary stress hormone. We need it to make vitamin D and then also bile acids, which help us digest fat. Cholesterol is essential for brain health and bone health. The brain is the fattiest organ in the body. It's about 60% fat, and then about 25% of the total body cholesterol is found in the brain. So it also happens to be the most cholesterol-rich organ. Cholesterol also acts as an antioxidant in the brain, so it modulates inflammation, which is always a good thing. And then ultimately, the our blood level of cholesterol is a self-regulating system. So our body is what is deciding ultimately how much cholesterol we have circulating in our blood at any given time. About 85% of that amount is put into the bloodstream by our body. Only about 15% comes from our diet. So our body, in its infinite wisdom, is deciding how much cholesterol is synthesized by our body and put into the bloodstream. And it is our body, essentially, our body is not trying to kill us. Our body loves us and is always trying to keep us safe and healthy. And well, every cell in the human body, with the exception of red blood cells, is capable of synthesizing cholesterol. So the reason why we have so much redundancy in this pathway to produce cholesterol is because our body is really trying to make sure that we have enough of this essential molecule to do all of the things that our body needs it to do. So, yeah, that the argument of cholesterol being the bad guy is kind of a silly one, even on its surface. It's a whole other conversation to get into to talk about like what the real driver of cardiovascular disease is, but to just kind of summarize it as briefly as I can, it's really about inflammation. That's kind of the driving force behind every chronic disease, but cardiovascular disease is included in that list. And it's when cholesterol and LDL become oxidized that they become harmful, and the way that those molecules become oxidized is through inflammation. And when we're speaking about diet, the real driving force behind inflammation is, well, seed oils, but also refined carbohydrates and sugar and imbalanced, uh, dysregulated blood sugar. So we have been sort of fingering the wrong suspect here. All right, so the final myth I want to push up against here is kind of an offshoot of the diet heart hypothesis, and this is the idea that a low fat and a high carbohydrate diet is supportive of metabolic health. Um, similarly to the diet heart hypothesis as well, this has become sort of a matter of public health policy. And you can see that in the good old food pyramid. I know that the USDA has changed the schematic and now it's like the My Plate, image, but the guidelines haven't changed. They just kind of, came up with a new drawing. But the current USDA dietary guidelines are telling us that we should be eating about 65% of our calories as carbohydrates. That is a lot of carbohydrates. Now, I know that not all carbohydrates are created equally, but for the purpose of giving you sort of a mathematical equivalence here, about 65% of calories from carbohydrates represents close to 1.5 cups of glucose. And that is a lot to ask of our pancreas and our body to manage that much glucose on a daily basis. Um, these recommendations also say that we should be getting about 20% of our calories from fat, and that represents a really severe restriction of this essential macronutrient. We need fat to do all of those things that I just named. So getting only 20% of our calories, up to 20%, is like, it's a really severe restriction. So here's the fun thing about the USDA dietary guidelines is that if you were to follow them to the letter, you still would not meet the minimum nutritional needs of humans. And that's even with the inclusion of animal foods. And there's actually a little blurb in the guidelines that mentions the inclusion of fortified refined carbohydrates in order to address the nutrient shortfalls that come from these guidelines. So it's like, it's so confusing. unless you look at it from the cynical lens, which I'm not, that's not a challenge for me. But basically, what we're dealing with here with these guidelines is this sort of patchwork approach to nutrition, where ultra processed foods that are fortified are mentioned as being included in the diet in order to compensate for the deficiencies that are created by the very guidelines that are being promoted. So it's kind of what I call a fortified pretzel logic. It doesn't really make any sense if you're looking at it through the lens of like human nutrition. So yeah, don't listen to them, is what I would say. Okay, so in order to further unpack this myth of a high carb and a low fat diet being supportive of metabolic health, I'm going to give you just a really brief macronutrient primer here. There are, of course, three macros. There's fat, protein, and carbs. And as I mentioned before, it's protein and fat that actually build the body, and carbohydrates are there to fuel the body. Then there's this idea of dietary essentials. So these are things that we have to get from our diet because our body can't make them. And we have two essential fatty acids, an omega-6 and an omega-3. We have nine essential amino acids, but there are no essential carbohydrates. And there are a number of reasons why we don't have to have carbs in the diet. And one of them is this biological process known as gluconeogenesis. There's just a big word that means that our body is able to turn certain fatty acids and amino acids into glucose when it's needed and it's not available in the diet. And then there's also this metabolic state of ketosis, and that's where our body is able to switch from burning glucose as fuel to burning fat as fuel. And that ability to switch between the two, between glucose and fat as an energy source, is known as metabolic flexibility. And this is a flexibility that we are rapidly losing on a collective level because we are completely awash in carbohydrates. Like it's very rare, certainly for somebody who's eating the standard American diet, to ever go without glucose in their bloodstream, without some sort of carb in their diet. And again, that's not how we evolved. So we're losing that ability because glucose and carbohydrates are just omnipresent. Okay, one other thing I want to talk about here is this idea of calories in equaling calories out. Anytime you bring math into this sort of complex topic, you've lost the plot. Not all calories are created equal. 300 calories of, beef liver is certainly different than 300 calories of a Krispy Kreme donut, which I think is the equivalent of like licking it twice. Um, so these macronutrients all provide calories, but they also have very different physiological effects on the body. And I'll get into that a little bit more in a second here, but I want to give y'all this analogy that I find to be useful, which is the idea of our macronutrients and the energy that they provide being compared to building a fire. So when you build a fire, you need your kindling, and that's the fuel that like burns really quick, and you get this big burst of energy, but then it dies out really quickly. So that would be your carbohydrates. If you eat a meal that is strictly carbs, you're going to get a big hit of energy, a big hit of glucose, and it's going to burn up real fast, and then you're going to be hungry again shortly thereafter. And so therefore eating a high carb diet means that you're likely to have hunger and cravings and to overeat. Now, protein is sort of in the middle. Ideally, we're not burning protein as fuel. That usually happens when we're in a state of deep fasting or in a state of starvation, because that would mean that we're muscle wasting. But they're kind of, they would be in the middle of that analogy. They would be the bigger sticks. And branches, and then the big logs that you throw on a fire that burn for a really long time, that would be your fat. So if you eat a meal that is purely fat, you're going to feel sated. You're going to have that energy last for a long time. It's going to burn for a while, and so you're likely to not overeat and not be hungry shortly thereafter. Okay, so we're going to dig into the metabolic story of carbs versus fats here real briefly. So when I talk about carbs, I'm talking about plants because almost all carbohydrates are found in plant foods, with the sole exception of lactose, which is found in dairy. That's the milk sugar. But I tend to use carbs and plants interchangeably for this reason. So carbohydrates are the only macronutrients that have a direct and proportional effect on blood sugar, meaning the more carbs that you eat, the greater the spike in blood sugar that you will experience. And the reason I'm talking about this metabolic story through the lens of blood sugar balance is because this really and truly is the key component of metabolic health. Our body goes to great lengths to keep our blood sugar within a certain range because if it goes too high or too low, that can be life-threatening. So essentially, if you're eating a diet that is high in carbohydrates, that means you're going to have chronically high blood sugar. If you have chronically high blood sugar, you will also have chronically high insulin levels. If your insulin stays high for a long time, you're going to start to develop insulin resistance, and that will eventually turn into diabetes. And this is a disease state that is very complicated, and obviously best to avoid. And then a couple of points about insulin. Insulin is our body's primary fat storage hormone. So, again, what that means is if you're eating a diet that's high in carbs and you have chronically high blood sugar and chronically high insulin, then that means that you're constantly in a state of fat storage. And when we accumulate fat, that leads to greater insulin resistance. Insulin is also our body as a pro-inflammatory hormone. So if we have chronically high insulin, then we're going to be in a state of chronic inflammation, and that will also reduce the efficiency of insulin signaling. So what we have here are these two pathways that are leading into the same positive feedback loop that are pushing us into a state of metabolic imbalance and dysfunction. And then just sort of to hit this note one more time, high carb diet tends to be a nutrient deficient diet. Like I said, if you're eating a strictly plant-based diet, you have those nutrient deficiencies. And then additionally, the vast majority of carbs that are consumed in the standard American diet are refined carbs. And so they don't have any nutritional value. Okay, now switching gears to the metabolic story of fat. Um, Fat is found in greater concentrations and in more appropriate, as a more appropriate profile in animal foods versus plant foods. And both fat and protein as macronutrients have no direct effect on blood sugar. So you could eat a meal that was just fat and protein, and your blood sugar would basically be just a flat line, right where you want it. So there are a number of metabolic benefits of fat. Once again, looking at this through the lens of blood sugar balance. When we are eating a higher fat diet, that means we're going to have lower levels of insulin because fat doesn't trigger insulin, only glucose does. So we're able to switch into fat burning mode because we have those lower levels of insulin. Also worth mentioning that fat is a more efficient, a more stable, and a cleaner burning fuel than glucose. So it's more efficient because it's more calorically dense. There are more calories per gram of fat than in protein or carbs. Um, and it's a more stable source of energy because we all have fat stores in our body to a greater or lesser extent. And so our body can access that fat to burn as fuel, and it also doesn't rely on this middleman of insulin, right? There's no other player in the game. It can just directly derive energy from fat stores. And then it's also a cleaner burning fuel because the metabolic process that is involved in converting glucose to energy releases a lot of free radicals, and free radicals are very inflammatory. You get fewer free radicals when you convert fat into energy. It's also fat is also the preferred energy source for the heart, the liver, and arguably the brain, and that's because of the neuroprotective properties that fats have. So I need to sort of add this little caveat here that when I'm talking about the metabolic benefits of fat, I'm referring to fat that comes from properly raised animals and plants. In this case, the fat is metabolically protective. Excuse me. But fat that comes from factory farmed animals, trans fats, seed oils, or fats that are consumed with sugars or refined carbohydrates are actually harmful to our health. So I want to get a little bit more granular on this topic of fats because it's super important. There's still this massive controversy out there around the idea of what is a healthy fat and what is an unhealthy fat. And this really goes back again to the just the distorted perspectives that the diet heart hypothesis has foisted upon us. But from my perspective, a healthy fat is any fat that comes from a properly sourced whole food. And an unhealthy fat is any fat that is industrially manufactured or chemically altered. So essentially, anytime humans start tinkering with nature, we know we've probably moved in the wrong direction. So I'm going to break it down a little bit here. by talking about unhealthy fats. So when I'm referring to industrially manufactured fats or oils, I'm talking about seed oils. And it's a long list. This is close to exhaustive. I may have missed a couple here, but canola, corn, cottonseed, grapeseed, peanut, sesame, sunflower, safflower, and soybean are all considered seed oils. A little bit of historical context. I think that's always really important in helping to make sense of what's happening presently. So, industrial seed oils were originally used, not surprisingly, in industrial applications. They were actually considered industry waste products, and they were used in things like um, paints, varnishes, biofuels, and all sorts of industrial applications. Now, during World War II, there was a need for us to domestically in this country ration fats. So, real fats were sent overseas to support the war effort. And then these industrial seed oils were repurposed as culinary oils to feed people domestically. Now, after the war ended, that practice continued and was actually ramped up. And these seed oils became even more incorporated into the food supply because industry loves nothing more than cheap inputs. And these seed oils, since they are industrial waste products, are obviously cheaper than real fats coming from animal foods. Um, and so that's how we ended up where we are now. Now, based on like the scientific reason why seed oils are bad for us, it's really because the primary type of fatty acid that is found in these seed oils are polyunsaturated fats. Now, the more saturated a fat is, the more chemically stable it is, meaning the more resistant it is to oxidizing when it's exposed to light and heat. So most of the oils in these seed oils are polyunsaturated, or most of the fatty acids are polyunsaturated. So they're really chemically delicate when they're exposed to heat and pressure and light. Now, the industrial process that is implemented to extract oils from these seeds involves high heat, high pressure exposure to light, and exposure to toxic additives like hexane, which is a known neurotoxin. And so that process ends up damaging these fats. And so these seed oils are rancid or oxidized as soon as they hit the grocery store shelf. And then we bring them home and we cook with them. And so we further damage them. And when we eat these oxidized oils, it causes massive inflammation in the body. One other reason why these seed oils are really damaging for human health is because they're primarily omega-6 polyunsaturated fatty acids. And omega-6 are more pro-inflammatory. Omega-3s are anti-inflammatory. So we need both. We need the gas and the brake when it comes to inflammation. But because these seed oils are so ubiquitous in ultra-processed foods, we're getting overdosed majorly. So we're looking at the ratio of 3 to 6. Ideally, we'd be at 1 to 1. But because of their prevalence in our industrial food system, we're getting overdosed. It's about 1 to 25 is what that ratio looks like for most of us. One other thing I want to mention about these seed oils is that they're also known in the industry as RBD oils, refined, bleached, and deodorized. So they're refined, that part is obvious. It's this very industrial manufacturing refinement process. They're bleached because when they are first extracted, they're like this really gross gray color. So they bleach them so they turn out this more palatable chartreuse sort of shade. And then they're deodorized because they stink, and they stink because they're rancid. So, like, yeah, sometimes it's all in a name. Sometimes it's just like hiding in plain sight. So that's what's up with that. Um, then moving on to the chemically altered fats, those are our trans fats. It's crazy to me on some level that these things are still allowed in our food supply. It also makes sense again from the cynical lens, but it's like common knowledge that these trans fats are really bad for us, and yet they're still added to a whole bunch of processed foods. Margarine is still something you can buy, but these trans fats are really they wreak havoc on our whole body health. They can cause leaky gut and insulin resistance and all sorts of nasty things. So always read your food labels. Trans fats are usually listed as partially hydrogenated, whatever kind of seed oil. Excuse me, seed oil. All right, moving on to the good stuff. We got the healthy fats. Again, these are fats that come from properly sourced whole foods. So meat, fish, eggs, dairy, and plants in their whole form have healthy fats. Nature doing what nature does, which is taking care of us. Now, as I mentioned before, the more saturated a fat is, the more stable it is when it's exposed to heat. So it's really important that we're not cooking with fats that are delicate. So the fats we want to cook with are the ones that tend to be solid at room temperature. So you have coconut oil and then all of your animal fats. So butter, ghee, tallow comes from cows, that's cow fat, lard from pigs, schmaltz is from chicken, and then duck fat. When it comes to things like olive oil and avocado oil, these are better used as finishing oils. So you add them to your food after it's been removed from the heat. And that's because these oils are liquid at room temperature. They have a greater concentration of mono unsaturated fatty acids. So they're more delicate than the saturated fats. Okay, so I'm going to close with a couple more quotes. I do love quotes here. We've got this first one from Dr. Peter Attia. He's a physician as well as an author. And he said, much of the advice we've been given over the last 30 years about avoiding saturated fat and cholesterol has been wrong. So that's pretty direct. And then Dr. Willett from the Harvard School of Public Health said, the overzealous focus on reducing total and saturated fat intake has been a misdirection, contributing to the current epidemics of obesity and diabetes. And after discussing the, metabolic story of carbs, that hopefully makes sense. Okay, in closing, I just kind of want to take a moment to illustrate to you all like kind of what we're up against here. I saw this this headline the other day. I'll admit I did not read the article because the headline was enough for me. I was like, I think I know where this is going. But it's just so classic. Eating this ultra processed food may be good for you and the planet, experts say. So anytime you see experts say, it should be a red flag that you're probably dealing with scientism, especially when it's following like such a patently absurd declaration in the first place. Like I don't have a lot of certainty about a lot of things, but I can tell you without question that ultra processed food is never good for you or the planet, period. It's made in a factory. That's just not the way it works. So anyway, this is our world where we're awash in this kind of, absurd scientism. So uh, that's what's going on. So just in closing, in order for us to properly care for ourselves in this day and age, I think that it's going to require an entirely new framework of thinking that is rooted in like skepticism and more critical thinking. Because what we're needing in order to be healthy is this return to balance by reconnecting to ourselves, our bodies, our food, and nature. And we're in this time of really deep disconnection where technology is just more and more replacing nature. Food is being engineered in labs and it's being sold to us as progress, when of course it's not progress. It's moving absolutely in the wrong direction because these Franken foods are not aligned to our nutritional needs or the designs of our body. And so every step of the way in this weird and twisted journey that we're on, scientism is going to try to convince us that technology is superior to nature. And we need to recognize that these stories are really meant to prop up systems that serve profit rather than public health. So, kind of closing where we started, I just want to encourage people to stay open and curious and really begin to question what we're being told because more and more it seems that our health is dependent, excuse me, dependent on that. So, all right, that was it. That's what I got. Does anybody have any questions or comments? You want to dialogue for a few
I have
minutes?
a million questions and comments.
Yay. All right, well, let me ask
Um,
them.
yeah, first of all, fascinating talk. I really loved it. I think
Thank you.
every human needs to hear this. So hope we can pump this out to more people and just love the commentary on scientism versus science. And that's something that I think about and talk a lot about. And yet so many people don't understand, which is just wild to me and very frustrating. So just want to emphasize that. And also want to note, yeah, I've been thinking about reaching out and booking a one-on-one with you because of my chronic migraines, and I won't go into the details, but I have a food panel that's coming in, so that should be
Mm.
some good data too. Um, but yeah, so shout out to anybody. Please book a one-on-one with Stephanie to take advantage of this vast wealth of knowledge. And then the actual question, probably the biggest question I had, I guess, is kind of like if you could re-engineer that food pyramid or the food plate, what would
Mhm.
that look like? Are we looking at like a carnivore diet or carnivore type diet? How much carbs do we really need? And like how much plants like fruits and vegetables? I mean, I'm kind of taking away to be a very small amount of carbs, a very small amount of fruits and vegetables. Um, and then I guess sort of secondary to that, would that be like, I guess what meats, like is red meat necessarily a bad thing in your view? Or could you just be eating beef for breakfast, lunch, and dinner and just be
Mhm.
killing it nutritionally? So yeah, I'll stop talking there.
No, those are great questions, really good ones. So, starting at the top, if I were to rejigger the USDA dietary guidelines, I would just swap fat with carbs. We need a lot more fat. It's just been demonized for, the reasons, in part, the reasons that I've discussed. Um, Now, as far as like the keto or the carnivore diet, some people do really, really well on those types of diets. And I would say that primarily we're talking about people who are dealing with really deep metabolic dysfunction. So people with diabetes, for example, or there's a lot of really great evidence of how the keto diet can be supportive in cancer treatment. I'm not an expert in either of those sort of, I would call them more extreme diets, and I don't mean that in a pejorative sense, but they tend to be more on the fringes. But I would just recommend a diet that is more focused on healthy fat and protein. And again, like how many carbs do we need? Well, if you want me to answer that question like in a very technical and specific way, I would say we don't need any carbohydrates because, like I said, there are no essential carbohydrates. But the thing about plants that's so wonderful is that they're very cleansing. So animal foods will build the body, and then plant foods will cleanse the body. So there are a lot of really wonderful phytonutrients, and they can be very beneficial. You can make an argument that fiber is really good for us. I would say that fiber, the caveat there is that fiber is really great for us because it feeds our microorganisms, our gut microbes. But if we have a dysbiosis situation, then that fiber and those resistant starches are feeding both the good and the bad bacteria equally. So the focus then becomes on, well, let's rebalance the microbiome so that those prebiotics is what they're known as. They're the ones that feed our microbes so that they're feeding the microbes that we want to be feeding. So it's kind of, it gets very nuanced. And then your other question about red meat. Um, so the thing is that if you're eating red meat or any animal product that is coming from the factory farming system, then as I mentioned before, that's going to be metabolically disruptive and harmful. And that's in for a number of reasons. But one of the main reasons is that those animals are being fed grains that they're not biologically designed to eat. And those grains are going to cause the meat to have a higher concentration of omega-6 fatty acids. And as I mentioned, omega-6s are pro-inflammatory. So when it comes to properly sourcing your meat, that's really the key. Um, if you were to eat a carnivore diet that was primarily red meat, but you were getting it from grass-fed, like pasture-raised, happy animals, then I would say that there's no metabolic downside to that. And again, it can be really supportive for people who are dealing with blood sugar issues or any other metabolic issues. Um, so when I work with clients, I'm not pushing them towards keto or carnivore necessarily, unless they have something like inflammatory bowel disease or some kind of really severe digestive issues, because fiber can be really difficult for people to digest if their digestive system is damaged, plants in general. Um, so yeah, I mean, I could talk in circles about this for hours, but I would say generally speaking, you want to be switching the percentages of fat and carbs around so you're getting a much higher percentage of fat and a much lower percentage of carbs.
Awesome.
Yeah, and again, it's like that just when we're looking at it from the blood sugar regulation perspective, carbs are what's going to throw that into a roller coaster, whereas fat and protein are going to keep you nice and stable. So it's really about combinations and yeah, switching those percentages up.
Great. Yeah. Good to know. We're lucky to source our red meat from the family farm. So long line of cattle. farmers in Shannon's side of the family, so we're lucky on that front.
Beef
But
for breakfast, lunch, and dinner.
That's awesome.
I mean, I'm not
I
against
also am
giving me a pass, you know.
I'm also a big organ meat pusher.
Hmm.
We're not muscle meat is great as an option. And again, especially if it comes from, happy animals. But the most nutrient dense part of the animal is the organ. It can, in the long run, start to become a little bit more problematic because that's not what we weren't meant to eat this sort of like vivisected, like no fat, just pure muscle meat. Like again, we're sort of moving away from how we naturally evolved to be eating. So getting used to eating fat, getting fattier cuts,
Hmm.
um, and then getting into organ meat. It's an acquired taste, but eventually you will acquire it if you.
Hmm.
Oh, I think my internet died.
Yeah,
A
you
little
cut in and
choppy,
out a
but
little bit there, but
yeah.
I got most of it.
I cut out. Sorry
Yeah,
about, yeah, sorry about that. I'm back.
you're good. Yeah, we've got a couple of bricks of frozen liver in the freezer, so this is our motivation to bust them out. But anyway, I'll stop
Yeah,
talking to you.
pate is the gateway meal for eating organ meat. So I can give you a
Okay.
pate recipe.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, well, I'll stop talking so Gail and Shannon can have questions or comments if they want.
Stephanie, just fascinating. What is kind of your recommendation for people who grew up my whole life eating the standard American diet because that's what was good for you. Um, but how do you start to make those shifts and where do you recommend people really focus if you're changing and trying to be healthier and repair some of this damage that has been done by following inappropriate food advice?
Really great question. So the number one thing is just to get the ultra processed food out of the diet because when we do that, we eliminate so many of the things that make us sick, and then we go from taxing our body to actually nourishing it. So that would be number
Mhm.
one, and it's also huge as a hurdle for people who are used to the convenience and the standard American diet and all of that. Like that, everything is so hyper palatable. These foods are literally engineered by like neuroscientists to be addictive, to trigger those pleasure centers.
Mhm.
So I don't say that flippantly. It's a really big ask for folks who have never tried to eat a whole food diet before. So I would say if you can get the ultra processed food out of the diet, you're like 70% of the way there. And the rest of it is kind of just dialing things in. So that would be my number one recommendation. And then to go a little bit deeper, start looking at introducing more probiotic foods. So fermented foods, sauerkraut, kimchi, kombucha, these kinds of things. Because that's another really key component is the microbiome and the health of that.
Okay.
So yeah, I mean, those are kind of the main things. That would be no ultra processed food, more fat and protein than carbs, um, and then bringing in the probiotic foods and the ferments. Yeah, good question.
Thank you.
Hmm.
And I know so much of this stuff already, but like hearing, like re-hearing it the way that you like break it down into like where it all comes from is so like more embodying and just like cringy.
It's infuriating for
Yeah.
me. I'm
Yeah.
infuriated by it.
And it makes me sad. Like we have a lot of family and friends that have kind of live in that place and I mean especially generationally like our parents' generation still, I mean, my mother, you can still find margarine in her and it like ugh.
Yeah,
But
yeah.
it's wild. So it just helps to kind of hear it from like the root cause of like where it came from. But I think especially to me, what was more, I might have heard you talk about that before, but to really break down um and it's not popular. But the fact that like at the basis, like we are carnivores and how, but like the science behind like our digestive system and why
Hmm.
um
Mhm.
makes so much sense.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. And I mean, it's interesting because it's kind of like it becomes so encoded in the language where like you ask people about dietary classifications, it's always the three. And it's like, well, no, there's more nuance to it. And it's not that we aren't also designed to eat plants, but it's that we aren't designed to be fully nourished by solely eating plants. And so that, yeah, that's an important thing to consider.
and that there are no essential carbohydrates like needed in our diet. Like
Yep.
we can sustain for such a long amount of time
Hmm.
on animal meats and fats. I mean, the fats in particular.
In particular. Yeah, I'll just share real briefly because I know we're past time, but this anecdote, I went to Dr. Natasha, the developer of the GAPS nutritional protocol, went to her farm this past winter. I know you both know about that. And there was a family there with their 9-year-old son, and they were telling me the story of how when their child was little bitty, he had asthma so bad that he was in and out of the hospital constantly. He had eczema from head to toe, like really severe eczema. And they were like obviously concerned that they were going to lose their son. He was just so sick. And, all the meds that they gave him, for the asthma just made everything worse. And they discovered the GAPS diet and they ended up putting him on the no plants GAPS diet, which is essentially carnivore, because every time that he would eat a vegetable, he would have an asthma attack. And so this young child was on the carnivore diet for about a year before they were able to start reintroducing plant material. And I'm seeing him as this 9-year-old who is like vibrant and healthy and completely, cured of his asthma and his eczema. And it's just, so this little kid who, is still in those very intensive like growth periods was eating a strictly carnivore diet and it saved his life. So, there's it, and I know that goes against like so many things that we've been told that some folks find it hard to believe. But I mean, the living proof, like sitting right in front of me, it was very compelling.
Mm. I have a client, one of my therapy clients that struggles really hard with eczema and definitely stress related there, but that'll be a
Yeah,
good note for me to talk about some dietary factors too and kind of explore that with him. So
yeah,
excited to get to bring that into my clinical practice a little bit more.
yeah. And I mean, the psychological stress piece is so important. I'm glad you mentioned that because you could be eating the cleanest diet and doing all of that stuff right. But if you're chronically stressed, then you're just not digesting well, because when we're in fight or flight, the digestion is not a priority, and so all of those resources are being sort of exported to escaping
Mhm.
to goes to
Mhm.
the brain and the muscles to mobilize you, but you're not digesting well. So that's a really important point to make. The body mind body connection is obviously a thing.
Yeah, I've been there.
Yeah,
So
I mean, I'm sure we all have.
yeah.
Well, I am so grateful to ICC and the three of you. Thank you so much for showing up and letting me talk at you for over an hour.
Thank you for sharing this. It's so
Super
valuable.
interesting.
Yeah, and I just really, really hope we can keep working this and massaging slowly into our culture, like
Yeah,
however we can. So
same, same. And
Yeah, and Stephanie, I know you're giving another similar talk. When is that one?
November 16th. November
Your
16th.
other similar.
Yeah, am I
Okay,
coming through? Yeah, I think so.
perfect.
Yeah, that one's gonna be like I want to, it's funny that I say this as a pharmacist, but I want to red pill people. And I think
Mhm.
it's really important that we understand how we ended up with the medical system that we have in this country. And it's a story that some people know, but not enough people know because it was never like, I mentioned that our industrial food systems were never
Mhm.
built on nutritional principles. Our healthcare system was never built on medical wisdom. It was built on profit. And I kind of trace that story by it all starts with John D. Rockefeller, which a lot of people don't know that little detail, but this oil tycoon is the reason why we have the healthcare system that we have today. And I mean, the nuts and bolts of it, right? It's pretty, it's it it's dark and yet it explains so much. And I think that when we have that historical perspective, it's like, oh, now I understand what we're up against and now I understand why things look the way that they do. So that's kind of what I'll get into in the next one.
Awesome. Well, thanks so much, Shannon, and genuinely, it
I am
was
looking
my
forward to
pleasure.
it.
Okay, can't wait to see you there.
Yes. Yeah, my pleasure to attend because I learned so much and I needed this so much, like even on a practical level, navigating my own dietary challenges, and it's been a struggle for years with the
Mm,
migraines, and I'm always like I've cut out so much, like added sugar, now even a lot of fruit, all dairy, all gluten, and sometimes it's so hard, and then I
yeah.
still have migraines, so and like sometimes twice, three times a week.
Oof,
It's like
yeah.
it's a lot. So, and I think in a broader sense, I just hope that people like build value around this kind of discussion. And I wish that it was more valued in society and more people would show up for this kind of talk because they don't like understand like how important this stuff is. So, hopefully, we can continue to work that angle, and
Yeah.
people out there will, come to hear the message. So thank
Yeah,
you for
thank you. Well, I'm
holding
always happy to be
space.
a mouthpiece. If there's ever an audience you think that I could speak in front of, that's my thing at this point. I'm just like,
Sure.
open your mouth and swallow this red pill.
I'm here for
Yeah.
it. I've taken
Yeah.
many red pills before. So,
That's good company for sure.
uh,
All right. Well, thanks, guys. This was a blast. I appreciate you.
Thank
thank
you
you,
so much.
Stephanie.
Yeah,
It's a
Thank
my
great
pleasure.
you.
time.
All right. Till next time.
See you.
Bye.
Bye.